Okay, so welcome to the online portion of this course, which is how we'll meet for the remainder of the semester. I'm going to be making a number of these videos each week. They're going to range anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour. I think the optimal length should be about 45 minutes. I think anything shorter than that, you're not quite getting back. Now, GDP fell by just under 1% during the dot-com bomb, or the bursting of the dot-com bubble in 2000. Now, in the 2007 recession, GDP fell by nearly 5%. So when the projections for the recession that is likely coming are around 20%, we can see how that is a particularly awful thing. Now, there have been 11 recessions in the last 100 years in the United States, 10 recessions in the last 100 years in the U.S., each one lasting an average of about 10 months, so just shy of 1 year. So that what that usually means is that as the economy starts to dip, some firms will close, you'll see unemployment spike, and there's ultimately going to be a restructuring of the economy. The way resources are going to be used will be changed, and as the economy restructures, it begins to build itself back up. Now, these recessions have ultimately two sides that could be causing them, or two types of shocks that can cause them. The two types of shocks that can be causing a recession are the following. Actually, start with supply side. So we can have supply side shocks. All right, supply side shocks are ultimately real shocks. They are shocks that deal with the productive capacity of the economy. So, if we were considering the Solo model, and there's a particular shock in the Solo model, well, that would be a supply side shock. It's a real shock. So, real supply side variables. What does that mean? Well, there's something that happens to capital, physical capital. If there's anything that happens to physical capital, that is going to be reducing the productive capacity of the economy, thereby causing some sort of a shock. Well, actually, it would be a negative shock. It would be a negative supply shock. All right, so if we have physical capital, that can cause a supply side shock. Now, here's something else that can cause a supply side shock, and this one's actually much more relevant right now. Labor supply shocks. Labor supply shock is a particularly relevant one right now. Namely, the coronavirus is greatly reducing the labor supply. Now, granted, the death rates are still somewhat low, unless it's Italy, in which case their death rates are much higher. However, given that the testing is not exactly widespread, and they're not really sure exactly who does and does not have the disease, the death rates are a little questionable at the moment. However, anything that happens to the labor supply would again be a real economic shock, and it would be happening on the supply side of things. All right, so what can be causing a labor supply shock? Well, changes the minimum wage. All right, if the real wage gets changed, that's going to be causing a real shock on the supply side. Widespread pandemic, coronavirus, will be causing a real economic shock. It's going to be causing a decline in production. All right, but there's other things that can be causing real shocks as well. Three words you've probably heard more than any other three words in my class so far, and I promise they're actually not even my three favorite words, but you can have a total factor productivity shock. All right, so the AT term. All right, when there's a total factor productivity shock, that's going to cause a real economic shock. Why? Because if there's some new idea, some new invention, anything like that, that is increasing both the efficiency of capital and labor by the exact same amount, then that is going to be increasing the efficiency of production, thereby relieving the resource constraint just a little bit more, which means that we can produce more, we can spend more. All right, but we can also have shocks to the efficiency of physical capital. All right, now if we consider the total factor productivity shock, recall total factor productivity showed up in the form of this. Where what we would see is an increase in total factor productivity would be increasing the efficiency in both capital and labor by the same amounts. All right, this was called solo neutral Herod neutral technology? One second. And I'm back. So this is what's referred to as Hicks neutral technology. When there's a productivity shock that increases both capital and labor by the same amount as far as the efficiency is concerned, then that would be referred to as Hicks neutral technology. Now, any shock to the efficiency of physical capital, all right, this is referred to as Herod neutral technology. And what this looks like is a little different. And I know I've shown you this before, but it can't ever hurt to show you again. This is going to be increasing capital more than it will labor as far as the efficiency of it goes. So under Herod neutral technology, this is capital augmenting technology. We can also have shocks the efficiency of labor. All right, this is what's referred to as solo neutral technology. And under this one, what it's doing is it's increasing the efficiency of labor. Now, ultimately, all of these are different inventions, different ways of doing things, different ways of producing. However, really the most intuitive one to really think about is a solo neutral technology shock. In this case, we can think of AT as knowledge. Now, if the knowledge in the economy increases, if everybody goes to school or gets some kind of necessary training for human capital accumulation, right, that would be a solo neutral technology shock, meaning people get more knowledge, and having more knowledge, well, that is going to increase the way that the economy can operate. The example that I gave in class was that really fantastic movie called The Founder, where the two McDonald's brothers figured out the most efficient way to set up the production line. Now, we can argue that that was obviously going to be enhancing the efficiency of capital, but it was likely increasing the efficiency of labor more than it was capital. So it was likely a solo neutral technology shock because they figured out the fastest, quickest, which is also fastest, cheapest way to produce a burger, thereby reducing their costs of production. And by reducing their costs of production, while they can charge a lower price, they can be more competitive in the market. And really, I mean, at the time, what they were doing was relatively unprecedented. So not only were they adding a really new type of way to provide food to the consumer, they were doing it incredibly cheaply. That would be the acquisition of knowledge. Right now, sometimes the acquisition of knowledge isn't necessarily the best way to deal or the best way to have any of this stuff because, well, for example, there's plenty of knowledge in regards to the theory of how warp drive or faster than light flight might actually be possible, but we don't have any of the actual technology to be able to make it work. We know theoretically how it can work, but as far as actually implementing it in the real world, we're probably hundreds of years away from that. So that would also mean that, well, probably wouldn't be a very substantial shock to the economy until, of course, we had the technology, we had the capital needed to make that stuff happen that was actually in existence. However, these types of shocks to the production function are not going to be the same as a labor supply shock. Why not? Well, I guess I'm going to have to draw some graphs. So why are they not the same? Well, put simply, if we're thinking about a solo neutral technology shock, in which case knowledge is acquired, right, that is not the same as a labor supply shock. Why not? Well, because it's being driven by different factors and it's showing up in different parts of the production process. Namely, labor supply shock is going to be affecting the quantity of workers. However, a labor augmenting technology shock alters the quality of labor or workers, namely how efficient they are. All right, so I said there were two graphs that we would want to be looking at with this. Well, let's look at labor markets. All right, we're going to have a downward sloping labor demand curve and an upward sloping labor supply curve. And we're going to have ourselves an equilibrium in labor markets here, where labor supply and labor demand meet. All right, so really this is no different from what you saw in microeconomics. Now, if there's a labor supply shock, what happens is you would shift the labor supply curve either inward or outward. Actually, let's do a negative labor supply shock so we can kind of get an understanding of what is going on right now with this threat with COVID-19. So let's say huge virus outbreak, it reduces the labor supply. Well, what's going to happen is that first, because the labor supply is being reduced, the amount of labor in equilibrium is also going to be reduced. Yet at the same time, because there's less labor, assuming we're holding production constant, that is, there's less labor, then the wage is going to increase. Because firms are going to need more workers, but if workers are getting sick and dropping out of the labor force, they're going to have to pay more workers or incentivize these workers to basically come to work. Now, we're not talking the workers that are sick. Obviously, they can't work. However, they may try to get the existing workers that are still working at that firm that are not sick yet, they may try to incentivize them to work longer hours by raising their wages. We could see that here, right? Now, they may also try to incentivize other people to want to work for them. So let's say we can look at Grubhub, Uber Eats, DoorDash, any of those food delivery services. I'm sure they're probably doing quite well right now because a lot of people can't leave their homes, but they do have to eat. So in order to incentivize people to want to work for those particular companies to provide that service, well, they're going to have to offer them a much higher wage rate than what they would be getting before. So you can see people that are working for Grubhub, Uber Eats, etc., you can see that they're earning a lot more in their wages right now, which is absolutely totally consistent with what economic theory would suggest. But when there's a labor supply shock, what it's doing is it's affecting labor markets. So I'll just put a little addendum here. Labor supply shocks affect labor markets. So how is that different from a solo neutral or labor augmenting technology shock? Well, the labor augmenting technology shock, on the other hand, is affecting different things. Here, we've got a graph with wages and labor. Now here I'm going to have a graph with labor that is also on the horizontal axis. But instead of wages, I'm going to have output. So now I've got output as a function of labor. Now, this is going to be the production function in terms of labor. So with the solo model, we looked at it in terms of capital. All we're really doing is just sort of rotating it a little bit. So instead of looking at just the relationship between output and capital, now we're only looking at the relationship between output and labor. Now, it has the exact same general shape like this. Right, so I've got y as a function of capital. Now I'm holding capital constant, so I'm putting that horizontal bar over capital. Yet labor, I'm allowing it to vary. So this is for a fixed level of capital inputs, I'm looking at how labor is going to be affecting output. Now, if there is a labor augmenting technology shock, what that means is that we get a shift, or really a rotation, because remember, it always starts at the origin. So we get a rotation of this production function. So I'll have yt prime equals kt to the alpha bar times at prime lt to the 1 minus alpha. That's what happens under a labor augmenting technology shock. Now, in the case of what we've seen with the coronavirus, let's just assume for a minute that there is no change to knowledge. Well, if there's no change to knowledge in the economy as far as what's needed for just regular aggregate production of a final aggregate good, well, we would have our production curve looks like this. So I'm going to rewrite it. Like this. Now, originally, all right, if we've got labor on both, or on the horizontal axis for both of these graphs, I can literally just put these two graphs above one another. Now, if there was a negative labor supply shock, like what we've seen so far with COVID-19, people are getting sick, they're having to take time off work. In addition to that, a lot of companies are being forced to shut down by federal, state, and local governments in order to prevent any further spread of this disease in a way that would not necessarily overwhelm the capacity of hospitals as far as the beds that they have, the ICU units that they have, etc. We would rather not overwhelm them because that leads to triage situations which are particularly bad. That's where we just start having to let a lot of people die because we literally cannot do anything to take care of them anymore. So, when that happens, under a labor supply shock, well, we just stay on the same curve. Now, labor falls and output falls. All right, but just like when I showed how if we were to save more in the solo model, then we wouldn't move this curve whatsoever. If there's a labor supply shock, again, the exact same thing. The production curve isn't going to move. Why? Well, because knowledge in the economy hasn't changed, right? At least knowledge, as I said before, necessary for the production of whatever this final aggregate good is. Now, obviously, knowledge is changing when it comes to coronavirus, which may or may not be shifting this, but it will definitely be shifting this. So there are different sources of different types of shocks to the economy that can be driving how the economy is going to respond, which is what we're going to get into much, much later with a problem of identification and making sure that we can actually identify different types of economic shocks. So far we've looked at supply side shocks, and we discussed how labor supply shocks ultimately affect the quantity of labor, and it does so within labor markets. And labor augmenting technology shocks will be affecting the quality of labor, the knowledge that the workers have, the knowledge that the workers bring to the firm, and that will be affecting this particular curve rather than either curve in this particular market. But that's just one type of shock. That's just a supply side shock, and these are just a few examples of supply side shocks. There are also others that we could talk about, but ultimately what we get are rather similar types of economic predictions. So let's just keep it kind of simple and stick with these types of shocks. So we covered supply side shocks. Let's look at demand side shocks. Naturally, they come from the demand side of the economy. What we're going to be looking at for most demand side shocks are going to be nominal shocks. Now, there are multiple types of demand side shocks that we could talk about. The two that are really of particular interest are going to be fiscal policy and monetary policy shocks. Well, actually, no, you know what? I lied. There's one more that I want to talk about. We can have consumer preference shocks too. Those are going to matter. Quite a bit, actually. So there's going to be three that we want to look at, three that we want to consider, because these three are really what we need to be concerned about when it comes to analyzing the economy with how it is operating right now. So with these demand side shocks, right, as we can see, these are operating from a different side of the economy. Now, when I wrote out GDP, we had y equals c plus I plus g. Right? Y is a source of income. Well, y is the source of income. C plus I plus G would be the expenditures of that income. All right, now we see y is equal to C plus I plus G, meaning the source of income or the source of funds is also going to be equal to the expenditure of funds. The expenditure of funds can never exceed the source of funds, and it would just be common sense to say that the source of funds would never exceed the expenditures of funds, right? Because you're going to do something with it. Whether you consume, whether you save, etc., you're doing something with that income. So, because of that, we have equality. Now, this is ultimately an equilibrium condition. What does that mean? Well, it means that we've got multiple markets, and when y equals c plus I plus g, all those markets are going to be put into equilibrium. So if you remember Walras' law, right, if consumer markets and capital markets are going to be in equilibrium, then stuff regarding government spending is also going to be in equilibrium. Now, can't exactly say like government markets because it's not exactly a market thing that we're looking at when it comes to that. It's a little bit more complicated than that. However, none of these three added together can exceed this. So if this is a source of income, we can think of this as a supply side. All right, so the production stuff, y equals a times f of k and l, that would be sources to the supply side, or sources of supply side shocks. Now, there are markets for capital, there are markets for labor, which will also be driving the production function. So just because you can have a shock to the production function doesn't mean that's the only source of shocks, because you've got shocks driving the underlying markets for the inputs of production. So if you've got output as a function of capital and labor, if you've got a labor supply shock or you've got some shock to capital, like let's say I don't know, the country gets bombed and, you know, most of the productive capacity of that country is just wiped from existence, right? Well, that's going to be affecting labor and capital markets respectively, but it may not be affecting the level of the production function. So the production function may not be shifting if you have that, because what causes the production function to shift is a different type of shock. It would be a shock to the efficiency of capital, labor, or capital and labor together. So we've got multiple sources of supply side shocks, but ultimately what they do is they shift supply. Demand side shocks, on the other hand, shift, well, you guessed it, demand. Now what does this look like? Well, here what we're going to do is we're going to have output on the horizontal and price on the vertical axis. Now, because we're dealing with aggregated economic variables, we don't just have D for demand, we have AD for aggregate demand. So we have aggregate demand, and well, we also have, you guessed it, aggregate supply. Now, when aggregate demand and aggregate supply are in equilibrium, then we have our equilibrium output and price levels. Now, we can also do this in terms of rate. So we could also have, like, say, an inflation rate and a rate of growth of output rather than the level of prices and output. However, in this case, I'm just going to stick with levels. It's a little bit easier, and it's also a little bit more intuitive. Now, there is an aggregate supply curve that is upward sloping. But really, what I should be calling this is a short run aggregate supply curve that is sensitive to changes in price. And then we also have what's known as a long run aggregate supply curve, which, if you look at it, is vertical and is independent of the price level. What does this mean? Well, let's ignore the long run aggregate supply curve for just 1 second. So let's go ahead and erase that guy and look at just short run aggregate supply. And we want to initiate some shock to aggregate demand. All right, so we're going to allow it to either be a fiscal policy, monetary policy, or some type of preference shock. Now, we're going to learn how to identify each of these three later on in the course, but what we would see right now is it's going to be increasing aggregate demand. So when aggregate demand is increased, well, we increase output and the price level, just like when we see demand for a particular good in principles of micro increase, holding supply constant, we're going to see an increase in output and prices. Now, the interpretation of the short-run aggregate supply curve is a little bit different. Now, it's different because the way this guy works here is how slow prices are to adjust, how sticky prices are. Right? So if prices are sticky, I'll say sticky prices, which are also known as nominal rigidities. These sticky prices determine slope of the short-run aggregate supply curve. The stickier prices get, the flatter the short-run aggregate supply curve gets. Right, so let's look at what would happen if this coronavirus quarantine lasts for quite some time. Let's say it lasts for, I don't know, like 6 months. Well, when that happens, All right. First thing that's going to happen is, first the labor force is going to contract. Now, if the labor force contracts, you're going to see an inward shift of the labor supply curve.